Racist cops handcuff black man, panic when they learn he's the police chief. Malcolm Hayes had always believed that leadership meant setting an example, upholding justice, and ensuring that those who served under him did the same. But as he sat in his car that night, staring into the red and blue glow of flashing lights in his rearview mirror, he was reminded of an unsettling truth. No amount of authority, no position, and no title could shield him from the deeply ingrained biases that had plagued the system for generations. He knew the routine well. Hands visible, movements slow, voice calm. It didn't matter that he had spent the last decade reforming departments just like this one. Tonight, in the eyes of these officers, he was just another man who didn't belong. He exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel as he pulled over to the side of the road. He had done nothing wrong, he knew that. But knowing didn't change the reality of what was about to unfold. The first officer approached his window briskly, flashlight in hand, while the second lingered near the back of the car, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. License and registration, the first officer, whose name tag read Carter, demanded, his tone sharp, leaving no room for questions. Malcolm nodded, reaching carefully into his glove compartment before retrieving his wallet. "I'm getting my registration now," he narrated, making sure every movement was deliberate. "My license is in my wallet, I'll grab it next." Carter didn't respond, but Malcolm saw the way his grip on his flashlight tightened. This wasn't just a routine stop, there was something else at play here. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Carter asked, though it was clear he had already made up his mind. Before Malcolm could answer, the officer continued. "You were driving erratically, swerving into the other lane." Malcolm's brows furrowed slightly. He had been driving at exactly 29 miles per hour in a 35 zone, his car steady, his focus sharp. His dashcam footage would verify that. "With respect, officer," he said evenly, keeping his voice measured. "I wasn't swerving. My dashcam will confirm that." Carter's expression hardened. "Dashcam? Huh? That'll be confiscated for evidence. Step out of the vehicle." A flicker of frustration rose in Malcolm's chest, but he pushed it down. He had spent years advising people on what to do in these situations. Stay calm, comply, don't escalate. And yet, as the cold handcuffs clicked around his wrists moments later, he realized that even when you followed the rules, some people would always find a way to punish you for simply existing. The back seat of a squad car was not an unfamiliar setting for Malcolm Hayes. He had been inside plenty of them, just never like this. Never with his hands cuffed behind his back, his rights ignored, his dignity stripped away by officers who thought they had all the power. The patrol car rolled forward, its sirens silent, while Officers Carter and Reeves exchanged casual banter up front, acting as if they hadn't just detained a man without cause. Malcolm sat still, his breathing slow and controlled, his mind calculating. Anger wouldn't serve him here. Only strategy. The streetlights flickered past the window, illuminating familiar buildings, places he had spoken at, where he had mentored young officers, where he had fought for reform. And yet, none of that mattered to the men in front of him. "So," Officer Reeves finally said, glancing at Malcolm through the rearview mirror, his tone laced with amusement. "What's your deal? Late-night joyride? Or just felt like being difficult?" Malcolm met his gaze without emotion. "I was trying to get home." "Yeah, sure," Reeves scoffed. "That's what they all say." "They?" The word sat heavy in the air. Malcolm had spent his life trying to bridge the divide between communities and law enforcement, but here, in this moment, he was just another statistic to them. Another name on a report they'd manipulate to justify their actions. He exhaled slowly, turning his gaze back to the window. They didn't know who he was. Not yet. And when they did, the weight of their mistake would come crashing down. Minutes later, the car pulled into the precinct parking lot, its harsh fluorescent lights washing over them as they came to a stop. Carter yanked open the door, grabbing Malcolm's arm with unnecessary force. "Out," he ordered. Malcolm complied, keeping his step steady, his face unreadable. As they led him inside, officers at the front desk barely spared him a glance. Just another arrest in their eyes, a routine procedure. But that would change soon. As Carter and Reeves processed his information, Malcolm remained silent, waiting for the moment. Then finally, Carter read the name on his ID, A beat of silence followed, then another. His grip on the paperwork tightened. He looked at Malcolm, his jaw stiff. "You're joking." Malcolm didn't flinch. "I don't have much of a sense of humor." Carter's eyes darted to Reeves, then back to the ID in his hand. Because there, in bold letters, was a name they should have recognized before slapping cuffs on his wrists. Malcolm Hayes, police commissioner. Their boss. The air in the precinct turned suffocating as Officer Carter's fingers trembled slightly around Malcolm Hayes' ID. His name, printed in bold letters, carried a weight they weren't prepared for. The realization hit like a freight train. This wasn't just another routine arrest. They had detained their own police commissioner, the man in charge of their entire department. Malcolm remained silent, watching them, studying their expressions as panic started to creep into their eyes. Officer Reeves cleared his throat, trying to salvage the situation. "This must be some kind of misunderstanding," he muttered, his bravado from earlier replaced by uncertainty. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his voice steady. "Oh? A misunderstanding?" He let the words linger, watching them squirm. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you profiled, detained, and handcuffed an innocent man. And now that you realize who I am, you suddenly regret it?" Carter shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if hoping someone would step in and save them. The officers at the front desk, now aware of what was unfolding, had stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between Malcolm and the two men who had just brought him in. The tension was thick, the balance of power shifting right before their eyes. Malcolm took a slow step forward, the weight of his presence alone enough to make Carter and Reeves instinctively take a step back. "Tell me," Malcolm continued, his voice calm but laced with authority. "At what point in your training did you learn that pulling over a black man without cause was standard procedure? Was it before or after you decided to escalate the situation without reason?" Neither officer spoke. Their earlier confidence had crumbled into stunned silence. Carter opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but nothing came out. He knew there was no way to talk his way out of this one. "Let me guess," Malcolm went on, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "If I were anyone else, you would have pushed this all the way, booked me on some bogus charge, and made sure I spent the night in a holding cell. But now that you've realized exactly who I am, now you want to fix things?" Reeves exhaled sharply, frustration flashing in his eyes. "Look, Commissioner, Stop," Malcolm interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't insult me with excuses. What I want to know is this. Do you still stand by your actions, or do you only regret them now that they threaten your careers?" Carter swallowed hard. His silence was answer enough. The shift in power was complete. Malcolm had walked into the precinct as a suspect, but now the very men who had arrested him were the ones on trial. Silence suffocated the room, thick with the weight of consequence. Officer Carter and Officer Reeves stood frozen, their uniforms suddenly feeling heavier as the reality of their mistake set in. Malcolm Hayes, the very man they had humiliated and arrested without cause, was not just their superior, he was the police commissioner. He had the power to end their careers with a single word. The man they had treated like a suspect now held all the authority in the room, and the shift was undeniable. Malcolm could see it in their eyes. The regret, the fear, the desperate calculations running through their heads as they tried to salvage the wreckage of their careers. But he wasn't about to make it easy for them. The precinct, once a symphony of ringing phones and shuffling paperwork, had gone eerily still. Other officers had gathered near the periphery, their eyes darting between Malcolm and the two men who had wronged him. Some of them knew what was coming. Others had yet to understand the gravity of the moment. Carter cleared his throat, struggling to regain composure. "Sir, Malcolm held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Save it," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You don't get to explain this away. Not to me. Not to anyone." His gaze swept over both men, his next words landing like a gavel in a courtroom. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been stopped, detained, or humiliated simply because they didn't fit your idea of who belongs where." Reeves, whose confidence had evaporated into nervous silence, shifted uncomfortably. We didn't know," he said weakly. Malcolm let out a humorless chuckle. Exactly. And that's the problem. You didn't know, and you didn't care to find out. If I had been anyone else, I'd still be sitting in a holding cell, wouldn't I? Carter's jaw tightened. His hands twitched at his sides as if resisting the urge to ball them into fists. He wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. He was used to being in control. But control had slipped through his fingers the moment he'd slapped those handcuffs on the wrong man. At that moment, Lieutenant Morgan strode into the room, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She had already been briefed on the situation, and her expression was one of simmering fury. She turned to Malcolm first, offering him a nod of acknowledgement. "Commissioner Hayes, I apologize for what happened here tonight," she said firmly. "Rest assured, this will be handled." Malcolm nodded, but didn't take his eyes off Carter and Reeves. "Handled?" he repeated, tilting his head. "No, Lieutenant. This won't just be handled. It will be addressed, exposed, and corrected." He turned his full attention to the two officers before him. "Effective immediately. Both of you are suspended pending an internal investigation. Your body cam footage, my dash cam footage, and every report you've ever filed will be reviewed. And if I find even a hint of misconduct, I promise you, your days in law enforcement are over." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Carter and Reeves paled. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was a reckoning. The press conference room was packed. Cameras flashed, journalists murmured, and the tension in the air was suffocating. The city had been abuzz since the news broke, 2 officers suspended for racial profiling. But the real shock came when the world discovered exactly who they had targeted. Malcolm Hayes, the police commissioner, the very man responsible for ensuring fairness and justice in the department, had become the latest example of the system's failures. And now he was standing before the podium, prepared to hold them accountable in front of the world. As Malcolm stepped forward, the murmurs died down, the room settling into an uneasy silence. He placed both hands on the podium, scanning the crowd. His sharp gaze landed on familiar faces, community leaders, fellow officers, city officials, all of them waiting, some with unease, others with anticipation. He took a slow breath before speaking. "Last night, I was pulled over, detained, and treated like a suspect by 2 officers from my own department," he began, his voice steady, deliberate. "Despite having done nothing wrong, I was ordered out of my vehicle, handcuffed, and humiliated. And why? Because I fitted description? Because I was a black man driving home after dark? Let's call it what it is: racial profiling, abuse of power, and a failure of leadership within this department." A ripple of reactions spread through the room, some reporters furiously scribbling notes, others exchanging knowing glances. The city had seen cases like this before, but never at this level. Never had a police commissioner stood before them as both victim and reformer. Malcolm continued, his voice unwavering. "I want to make one thing clear. This is not just about me. This is about the culture we have allowed to fester in law enforcement. A culture that enables officers like Carter and Reeves to act without accountability. If it can happen to me, the highest-ranking officer in this city, imagine how often it happens to those who don't have the platform to speak out, to those whose voices are silenced by fear." The weight of his words settled over the room, thick and inescapable. He let the silence linger before pressing forward. "Effective immediately, I am launching a full-scale investigation into department practices regarding traffic stops, arrests, and officer conduct. Every complaint that has been ignored, every allegation that was swept under the rug will be reviewed. We will not allow this pattern of discrimination to continue unchecked." A murmur of approval rose from the community activists in attendance. Reporters began typing faster, headlines already forming in their minds. Malcolm wasn't finished. He took a measured step back from the podium before continuing, his tone sharper now. "To those who believe this is an overreaction, let me ask you, if I were anyone else, would we even be having this conversation? Or would I simply be another statistic? Another black man arrested, another mugshot circulating the internet, another name on a report that no one questions? That ends today." From the side of the room, Lieutenant Morgan watched intently. She had seen Malcolm command a room before, but never with this level of raw conviction. He wasn't just making a statement, he was drawing a line in the sand, forcing the department to choose between justice and complicity. A reporter raised his hand, voice tentative. "Commissioner Hayes, what happens to Officers Carter and Reeves now?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. He had already made up his mind. "They are under investigation, and if the evidence confirms what we already know, they will not only be fired, but I will personally ensure that they are never allowed to wear a badge again. Furthermore, any officer who believes that behavior like theirs is acceptable should turn in their resignation today, because there is no place for them in this department." The room erupted into a flurry of voices, some cheering, others firing off more questions, but Malcolm had said all he needed to say. Without another word, he turned and walked off the stage, his decision final, his message clear. The days of unchecked power were over. Malcolm Hayes sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled in thought. The press conference had done its job. Headlines blared across every major news outlet, social media was flooded with debates, and the police department was under a microscope like never before. Officers Carter and Reeves had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review, but Malcolm knew that wasn't enough. The people wanted more than temporary suspensions. They wanted justice. And Malcolm intended to give it to them. His office door swung open, and Lieutenant Morgan stepped in, her expression unreadable. She closed the door behind her before walking up to his desk. "Commissioner, the review board is already calling for their badges," she said, her voice even. "The footage we recovered from their body cams, it's worse than we thought." Malcolm lifted an eyebrow. He had seen the initial reports, but if Morgan was coming to him personally, it meant there was something she didn't want sitting in an email. "How bad?" he asked. Morgan exhaled sharply, setting a tablet down in front of him. "They weren't just profiling you. They were bragging about it. Listen." She tapped the screen, and the audio recording from Carter's body cam played. "Another one," Carter's voice sneered. "What is this, the third one this week?" Reeves chuckled. "They never learn. Probably thinks he's some big shot. They all do." Malcolm's stomach tightened. The ease in their voices, the arrogance, it wasn't just casual racism, it was habitual. A pattern. "Get this," Carter continued. "I saw his registration. He lives in that fancy neighborhood up north. No way he earned that. You know how these people are." Morgan stopped the recording. Malcolm didn't speak immediately. His fingers curled into a fist on the desk. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. These officers had made a sport out of abusing their power. "They didn't just profile me," he muttered. "They do this regularly." Morgan nodded. "And with the right push, we can prove it. I took the liberty of cross-referencing complaints against them. You won't be surprised to learn that over a dozen reports of racial profiling have been filed against Carter alone, all dismissed." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "Who covered for him?" Morgan hesitated before answering. "Captain Dunlap." Malcolm sat back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. Of course. Dunlap had been with the department for over 20 years, an old-school officer who believed in loyalty over accountability. He had always been resistant to change, to reform, and now Malcolm had proof that he had been shielding officers who didn't deserve a badge. Morgan studied him. "What's the move, sir?" Malcolm was silent for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. "We go public." Morgan blinked. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "This isn't just about Carter and Reeves anymore. It's about the entire system that allowed them to operate unchecked. We take this to the mayor, we push for an independent oversight committee, and we make sure every officer in this department knows that these days are over." Morgan gave a small, approving nod. "Understood. I'll start pulling records." Before she could leave, Malcolm added, "And get me a meeting with Captain Dunlap today." Morgan smirked. "That'll be an interesting conversation." Malcolm didn't return the smile. He'll either fix this or he'll go down with them. Later that afternoon, Malcolm stood in the center of the precinct's conference room, every high-ranking officer seated around the long table. At the head sat Captain Dunlap, arms crossed, jaw tight. The atmosphere was thick with tension. They all knew why they were here. Malcolm took his time, letting the silence settle before he finally spoke. "I've been in this department long enough to know how things work. We all have. Some officers take their badge as a symbol of service. Others take it as a license to oppress. The latter have been protected for too long. Dunlap scoffed. Commissioner, with all due respect, you're making this into a bigger issue than it needs to be. We're talking about two officers who were caught, Malcolm interrupted. How many weren't? Dunlap bristled but didn't answer. Malcolm continued. Carter and Reeves didn't act alone. They acted with confidence because they believed nothing would happen to them. And why wouldn't they? Every complaint against them was ignored, dismissed, buried. That ends today. The room was silent. Dunlap's face darkened. So what are you suggesting? Malcolm folded his arms. That we stop pretending this department doesn't have a problem. That we start cleaning house. Dunlap scoffed. And how do you propose we do that? Fire every officer who's had a complaint against them. Malcolm's voice was steel. If that's what it takes. A murmur rippled through the room. Dunlap shook his head. You'll have the union on your back. The mayor will call for restraint. Hell, the public will turn on us if they think we're gutting the department. Malcolm leaned forward. No, Captain. The public is already against us. They don't trust us, and we did that to ourselves. Dunlap looked away, his jaw working as he chewed on Malcolm's words. Finally, he exhaled. So what do you want from me? Malcolm met his gaze head-on. Your cooperation, your honesty, and your signature on the reform proposal we're about to send to the mayor. Dunlap hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. Fine, he muttered. Let's see the damn proposal. Malcolm nodded. This was only the beginning. The precinct's air was thick with tension, an unspoken storm brewing within its walls. Officers moved through the halls with uneasy glances, their conversations hushed, the usual camaraderie replaced by uncertainty. Malcolm Hayes had done something that hadn't been seen in years. He had forced the department to look inward, to reckon with its failures, and it left many officers questioning where they stood. Some were relieved, hoping for a change they had long believed impossible. Others were furious, feeling betrayed by one of their own. Malcolm walked through the station with quiet authority, his gaze unreadable as he passed by desks and briefing rooms. Every officer he passed stiffened slightly, unsure whether to meet his gaze or look away. He had always been respected, but now, for the first time, he was feared. Not for his power, but for his willingness to wield it against those who had long been untouchable. Lieutenant Morgan was waiting for him near the conference room, her arms crossed as she scanned the room of officers gathered inside. They're restless, she muttered. Some think you're doing the right thing. Others think you're dismantling the department. Malcolm gave a humorless smile. They're half right. He stepped inside, the hum of whispered conversations dying instantly. The room was packed with officers from every division, all waiting to hear what he had to say. At the far end of the table, Captain Dunlap sat stiffly, arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. Malcolm knew the captain well enough to recognize that behind the stone-faced expression was a man who was calculating his next move. Malcolm didn't waste time. I know a lot of you are angry, he began, his voice steady, filling the space without effort. Some of you think I've turned against you. Some of you think this is about making a statement. It's not. He let that sink in before continuing. This is about restoring integrity to this badge. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Others kept their eyes locked on him, listening. I'm not here to destroy this department, Malcolm said. I'm here to fix it, but fixing it means we have to acknowledge what's broken. And if you think that means betraying our own, then maybe you should ask yourself what loyalty really means. The silence was thick, but Malcolm could feel it. The shift. Some weren't ready to accept it yet, but others were, and that was enough. The press conference was set to begin in 10 minutes, but already reporters swarmed the steps of City Hall, cameras flashing, microphones being adjusted, and live broadcasts going on air. The energy was electric, a mix of anticipation and unease, as the public waited to hear what would come next. This wasn't just another press event. It was the beginning of something bigger. Malcolm Hayes stood behind the curtain in the hall, his posture straight, his expression composed. He had spent the past 24 hours navigating an onslaught of reactions, politicians scrambling for damage control, officers divided between support and outrage, and the public demanding accountability. But he wasn't here to play politics. He was here to tell the truth. Lieutenant Morgan stepped beside him, her voice low. "You're about to make a lot of enemies." Malcolm smirked slightly. "Then I must be doing something right." With that, he stepped onto the podium, the murmurs of the crowd dying as soon as he approached the microphone. The flashing cameras, the sea of reporters. It was nothing compared to the weight of the moment. "As many of you know, an incident occurred that has brought serious questions about accountability in our police force," he began, his voice strong but measured. "I was unlawfully detained by officers who abused their power. They assumed authority was on their side. What they didn't realize was that authority is only legitimate when it is just." Reporters leaned in, pens poised. Malcolm continued. "Effective immediately, I am launching a full-scale investigation into systemic misconduct within our department. No badge will protect those who violate the law. No uniform will shield them from consequences." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Malcolm didn't waver. He locked eyes with the cameras, making sure his next words left no room for misinterpretation. "This is not about one incident. This is about change. And whether the department stands with me or against me, change is coming." And with that, the reckoning began. The aftermath of Malcolm Hayes' press conference was nothing short of a storm. News outlets dissected his words, social media erupted with debates, and within hours, the mayor's office issued a cautious but firm statement in support of an internal review. The police union, however, was already pushing back, calling his approach divisive and unfair to hardworking officers. But Malcolm wasn't concerned about the noise. He had expected it. Change never came without resistance. As he sat in his office late that evening, the weight of his decision settled over him. He wasn't just making a statement. He was shifting the culture of law enforcement in real time. He glanced at the folder on his desk, a report detailing years of complaints, overlooked misconduct, and officers who had been protected by the same system meant to hold them accountable. This wasn't just about two rogue officers. It was about every time someone had been stopped, questioned, detained, or worse, simply because of bias. His phone buzzed. It was an email from a woman named Danielle Reynolds, the sister of a man who had been wrongfully arrested 5 years ago and spent months fighting to clear his name. "Thank you," it read. "People like my brother don't get second chances, but maybe because of what you're doing, someone else will." Malcolm exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before he typed a response. "We still have a long way to go, but I promise you, this is only the beginning." He hit send, then leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline beyond his window. Tonight, the fight felt like a mountain. But tomorrow the work would continue, because real change didn't happen in a single moment. It was built, piece by piece, by those willing to stand when it mattered most.